Well, ladies and gentlemen, I trust you enjoyed your second course tonight. As we said previously, we're delighted tonight to have with us the Australian Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd. And I'd now like to call on Mr. Rudd to say some words before we do our Australian of the Year in the UK Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, the Australian Foreign Minister, the Honourable Kevin Rudd.
Thank you very much, and fellow Australians, one and all, welcome to Australia House, these humble digs of our High Commissioner. And in fact, I'd like to make a proposition to you this evening of a correct nature, and that is in honour of the distinguished incumbent. Henceforth, we will not refer to it as Australia House, but as Douth House. And John's agreeable to this, modest man that he is. I'm attracted by the poetry, it rhymes. But I assume there's a majority in the room who would support it being so called. Raise your hand if you think it's a good idea. Those against? There's two hands up the back there. High Commissioner, attend to them. Henceforth, Douth House, but the deal with the High Commissioner is that every Friday, any Australian at a loose end comes here for free drinks down below. Courtesy not of the Australian taxpayer, but the High Commissioner's own salary. Now, we've had that little exercise in democracy. Let me say something else about democracy. I'm delighted here this evening to acknowledge and to have been the dinner companion of Barry Humphries. And Barry Humphries made an observation about yours truly just after the 2007 election in Australia. What Barry said was he didn't think Australia was ready for a Prime Minister called Kevin. Well, can I just say history has declared its verdict, and Barry was right. Someone told me actually that Linton Crosby was here tonight. Are you here, Linton? Linton? Up the back there? Good. As you know from the Liberal Party of Australia. Henceforth, dispense with all expenditure on political market research, engage Humphries. He gets it intuitively. Mind you, I mean, having been liberated from the rigours of high office, I can now attend with much greater rigour, attention, love, affection and discipline to my charity of choice, that well-known therapy group otherwise called the International Society of Much Misunderstood Kevins. The known to us all, of course you will know, as the ISMMK. I'm the patron, Kevin Costner is the Honorary Secretary, Kevin Spacey, the Honorary Treasurer. Anyone here called Kevin? I rest my case. You know, Barry, every time I ask that question anywhere, no one puts their hand up. It distresses me. Of course, politics can be a rough game. I lost my first election. I was running as one of Paul Keating's stormtroopers, shock troopers in the 1996 Australian elections, which you may remember for the Australian Labor Party was the equivalent of the first day at the Battle of the Somme. No one was left. I think perhaps that may have been because, in my case, coming from Brisbane in the People's Republic of Queensland, you laugh. Any Queenslanders here? It's the cultural elite of the country. It's good to see. Note down those who scoffed. I put it down to the fact that Paul's then active engagement publicly with the redesign of Berlin didn't automatically resonate with the people who lived in the burbs of Brizzy. But we survived to fight another day. What I do remember, though, about that first engagement with Australian democracy was in 1996, knowing they were up against it, I decided to go and door knock. And being a person of some obsession, I decided that, together with my darling wife Therese, that I wonder if she's calling at the moment. No, it's about to be my wake-up call in Australia. We decided to door knock 36,000 homes, and we laid it out as a battle plan over 6 months, and we did it. We still lost the bloody election, but anyway, some said it was because I door knocked 36,000 homes. They all met me, but I do remember. You're laughing far too much down there, yeah. I do remember, however, any of you familiar with the great city of Brisbane, climbing up the hills of Coorparoo, a suburb in the middle of the electorate which I now represent, up and up, January, sweltering heat, 37 degrees, knowing that election day loomed with some gloom. And having got to the top and finally got to the place that I was going to door knock, they weren't even home. And it's a bit like, you know, there where you are with your campaign director, the equivalent of Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now saying, the horror, the horror. Anyway, we're there, not home, come back to the footpath, and then this dog emerges and bites me on the back of the leg. You know that fleshy bit at the back of your knee there? You ever had a dog bite you there? Yeah, I have, and it hurts. It drew blood. At that point, the owner of the house then emerges, and would you believe, she arrives in a late model Citroën, and she is French. And we have a large French colony in Coorparoo and Brisbane and Queensland. Well, 2 or 3. And she says to me in her opening gambit, what is the matter? I said, your dog just bit me. To which she said immortally, but my dog does not bite. And I said, but your dog does bite. And she said, where is the evidence? And I said, here, in the back of my leg. She said, remove your trousers. Now, Brisbane's a little bit conservative, and the thought of removing your trousers in the middle of an election campaign in the Brisbane heat struck me as perhaps unwise. And then she said immortally, but I'm a doctor, there is pas de problème, there is no problem. And I said, I'm not removing my trousers for you, you have to take me at my word, your dog bit me. And she said, there is no evidence, case closed, you are dead. Once again, a very prescient remark politically, Barry. The other thing I'd say as I wander through my copious notes for this evening is one advantage, perhaps, which derives from having been in the office of the Prime Minister of Australia, is that the Mormon Church kicks in. Now, you say, how does that happen? The Mormons have a huge belief in genealogy, so that they then take a huge effort in tracing the entire family histories of heads of government across the world. Salt Lake City, Utah, there's a huge repository of family histories for deep theological reasons which attach to the Mormon faith. And so they began this research project on me. And I knew I had a convict forebear, but I should confess this in Her Britannic Majesty's realm, that they discovered that in my direct family line I have 5 convicts. You know, some say it was an excellent preparation for politics. My family lineage, they told me, was classically Anglo-American. On the American side, my mother's family, De Veres, not related to the Earl of Oxford or those who assumed by some were in fact the real authors of Shakespeare's works. I can't claim any connection to any of that. But I do note that he exited Lexington, Kentucky in 1865 and fled to Sydney. I assume he fought for the Confederacy. But then on my father's side, Thomas Rudd. He was convicted of, in this fair city of London, for nicking a pair of shoes in 1788, an auspicious year for our country. But he missed the First Fleet, spent some time on hulks off Southampton, caught the Second Fleet, Anyone here familiar with the history of the Second Fleet? Any Second Fleeters? This is a great example of Australian public policy and British public policy at work. The First Fleet, Arthur Phillip, tremendous success. Nobody died, everyone got there, settled the place, got things going. Royal Navy then decides to hold a Royal Commission because it costs so much money. They then opened the Second Fleet to public tenders, and the entity which won the public tender for the Second Fleet, for which I hold you personally responsible, High Commissioner, was a bunch of West African slavers. And so as a result, this became known as the Death Fleet. And so they arrive in Sydney Cove, terrible conditions on board. One of the conditions of the tender, those of you in private enterprise will understand this, was that the captain of the fleet could retain for his own personal use and subsequent disposal any leftover victuals from the fleet. There's a bit of a price incentive there, which is don't feed these guys. Anyway, a third of them died. My forebear survived. He arrives in Sydney Cove, spends the rest of his 7 years, having been sent down for stealing a pair of shoes in London, and 1795 remarkably returns to England. Most of the folk down there, once they'd done their time, they stayed on and carved out a living. 1799, he reoffends. That takes talent. Like, this is not a pleasant voyage. This time he nicked a bag of sugar. You know from the Old Bailey transcript, the great thing about the Brits is they keep good records. It's all there at the Old Bailey. Those of you who are a bit dubious about your convict past, go there, look at it, you'll find it. This time, when he was accused of nicking a bag of sugar, the constabulary giving evidence against him said, "Ah, my lad, Rudd, we know him well." I assume that was dialect for he has a record. So off he goes again. In the entire history of Australia, so far as I know, no person has been transported to Australia twice. I think, as the great Oscar Wilde observed, to be transported once might be unfortunate. To be transported twice, well, that goes beyond the pale. So I do note, though, that my forebear ultimately acquired a degree of respectability when, in 1822, having been emancipated finally in 1807, he writes a letter to the Sydney Gazette asking for public works to be constructed in Campbelltown, signed Thomas Rudd, Esquire. So ennoblement had at last occurred. Anyway, that's my connection with this country. Can I say to all of you who are here tonight, thank you for supporting this event. I thank and acknowledge the role of the High Commissioner here, John Dowth, who I sent here as Prime Minister to be our High Commissioner. He's done a fantastic job, and I'd like to acknowledge that to all of you as Australians here tonight. To those of you who come from Australian business, and in this connection I'd particularly acknowledge the role of Phil Atkin, can I say Australian business in this city does an extraordinary job in Australia's name. So to Phil and to the team from Australian business and to all of you who are members, again I acknowledge you. Please put your hands together for them. And my third serious point for the night is this. This country, Britain, is a great country. So is ours, Australia. And together we can do enormous things around the world, arm in arm. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Minister. We are now going to make our 3 annual awards, and I've asked Mr. Rudd and the High Commissioner to join on the stage for these awards. The first award is our Young Australian Achiever of the Year award. This was introduced in 2005 and recognises the achievements of a young Australian in the UK in any field of endeavour: business, sport, arts, culture and the professions. The previous winners have been Harry Kuehl, Shane Osborne, Joe Roff, Chloe Chick, Matt Wilkin, Dr Ainsley Newson, and last year was Tim Mitchin. Yasmin Searle has certainly proved that if you are highly talented, committed, and truly love what you can achieve great success in your chosen field. It's well known that the international world of fashion and fashion retailing is notoriously difficult and fickle, but that has not stopped this young Australian making a considerable and fashionable impact in the fashion world, and the Australian Day Foundation considers Yasmin Searle a very worthy recipient of the 2012 Young Australian Achiever of the Year in the UK. Yasmin.
I'll just say that I've always been so proud to be Australian, but not so much as I am tonight. I'm really touched. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Our second award is the Honorary Australian of the Year award. This award offers the opportunity to recognise a non-Australian resident of the UK who displays Australian characteristics or has contributed significantly to Australia. The previous winners have been Hazel Murphy, Alan Wicker, Baroness Greenfield, Lloyd Dorfman, Lord Carrington, Sir David Attenborough, Sir Robert Wilson and Lord Goodlad. Matthew Dukes has undoubtedly made a huge contribution to the Australian wine industry, and his Hall of Fame of the 100 Best Australian Wines has been a huge success. Matthew has also made a huge difference to the lives of many of the homeless, and as patron and founder of the Touch Wine Australia, he gives up a great deal of his time to raise money for the charity. In fact, he spends so much of his time down under that many Australians think he's actually one of us. The Australian Day Foundation considers Matthew Dukes an Honorary Australian and confers on him the 2012 Honorary Australian of the Year in the UK award. Matthew.
Couple of quick words. Gosh, way back sort of 25 years ago, I started in the wine trade in the UK, a little shop called the Barnes Wine Shop down in SW13. And on my very first day, I tasted a whole load of wines, of which Penfolds, De Bortoli, Peter Lehman, Yarra Yering, Cape Mentel, all these amazing names were poured for me. And from the very first day of my job, I sort of treated these wines with the same respect as I do the great Bordeaux's and the great Rhones and Champagnes and Ports. That hasn't changed. 25 years later, I'm lucky enough to go down to Australia 2 or 3 times a year doing my job tasting. And I get to meet all the Aussie winemakers who, as you probably know, have the most acute, work hard, play hard ethic of any category of society. And I have an incredibly good time. It's very, very exciting. I'm very lucky to be able to spread the word about the sort of amazing wines to a very large readership. I'm very proud to do so. It's a huge honour to work with such amazing wines. And I hope that in the next 25 years, I'll be able to do the same thing. And who knows, with the advances in medical science, I might be able to get into a third set of 25 as well. I'd like to thank the Australia Day Foundation for recognising me, but perhaps more importantly, certainly more importantly, the wine trade and Aussie wine as well with this award. I'd like you all to raise a glass of wine, a glass of Aussie wine, and propose a toast to Australian wine. I haven't got one, but my wife Amelia, who works with Australian wine, will do it for me. Please raise your glasses to Australian wine.
We agree. Thank you. Our third award is the award of the Australian of the Year in the UK. This award will provide everyone with the opportunity to recognise an Australian who has excelled in their own right in the United Kingdom, whether in science, business, sport, media, culture, film, television, radio, etc. The previous winners have been Clive James, Professor Lord May of Oxford, Professor Lloyd Bowers of Cambridge, Sir Charles Mackerras, Michael Hinsey, who's with us tonight, Jill Hicks, John Williams and Stuart Devlin. Well, how do you sum up Barry Humphries' extraordinary and varied talents? Quite simply, he's one of the funniest, most talented and revered artists Australia has produced. A genius really, someone whose career has been nothing short of remarkable. Barry Humphries is loved by millions of people throughout the world, and that in itself is an achievement worthy of recognition. The Australian Day Foundation considers Barry Humphries a very worthy, truly worthy recipient of the 2012 Australian of the Year in the UK Award. Barry Humphries.
Well, it's about time, really, I think. And extraordinarily enough, Kevin Rudd is actually a very nice person. I can say, Kevin, that I'm very pleasantly surprised to meet you. That joke about Kevin, oh, by the way, I should say, Your Excellency, Mr. Rudd, distinguished guests, and supporters, of course, of the Australia Day Foundation. Thank you very much. I can only say, in the words of a very famous Australian, I am humbled by this honour. This is the humblest, in order to remind you of the person I'm talking about, this is the humblest day of my life. No? Perhaps no one remembers Rupert Murdoch. It's beautiful to be in Australia House, one of my favourite buildings in London, when you think it's built during the First World War of all Australian materials. And I used to come here when I first came to London to read the Woman's Weekly. Upstairs, and just find out what the royal family were really doing. The Woman's Weekly had all the latest information, and they still do. We're such a conservative, wonderfully conservative country. Though the Labour Party still can't spell the word Labour. I've never understood that. It's one of those mysteries, Kevin, isn't it? And the reason there aren't a lot of Kevins is that the name has gone completely out of fashion. I remember a London taxi driver shouting at me across the street, "Hey, Barry! Hey, Barry!" So I turned and, with my newly acquired English disdainful expression, said, "Oh, are you talking to me?" He said, "Yeah, Barry." He said, he was convulsed with laughter. He said, "What's it like to be What's it like to have a Prime Minister called Kevin? Sorry. You see, the name Barry is equally sort of, well, old-fashioned. And no one ever gets called Alan anymore, do they? And there aren't many girls called Judy. We know some nice ladies called Judy, but no kiddies anymore. Unlike Mr. Rudd, I don't have any notes. I just couldn't believe this was happening. You know, it was like a strange dream. Australian of the Year. And, of course, the international date line has been changed. So, am I Australian of next year or of last year? And why has it been changed? I suppose so New Zealand can catch up with Samoa. But I do think that it is a sign of maturity in Australia that an award which has often gone to sporting figures has now gone to a sissy, a person who was bad at sport, conspicuously bad, except, as I pointed out, I was once fourth in the backstroke at school and sixth in the egg and spoon race. And I believe my friend, my embarrassing friend, Sir Les Patterson, the famous archetypal Australian diplomat, was pretty impressive in the three-legged race. It is a very nice room, this, and there used to be a woman called Strella Wilson. That pause was due to a reflection of mine that I am probably the oldest person here. It's frightening, isn't it, when you don't know what the experience is like, but when the Sunday papers come every day, or seem to. But I was not good at sport, and all the people who were good that I knew are dead. They are, I'm afraid. When I see them, when I return to my hometown of Melbourne, which I always inhabit, some people carry a Bible or the Book of Mormon. I carry the Melbourne Street Directory, the old one, before it went into 20 volumes, before Melbourne just began to touch the fringes of Canberra. And I love visiting remote suburbs still in Melbourne. You can never get to know Melbourne well enough. There is now a suburb called Mount Disappointment. Disdained by honeymoon couples. Think about it, think about it. And there's also a suburb of Melbourne called Ardea. Have you heard of it? Ardea. People said, why is it called Ardea? I said, well, I suppose the explorers, when they came close to it, you know, looked and said, oh dear. But, you see, it is a sign that Australia has come of age that I should get this wonderful, well, quite nice piece of metal. because it wasn't all that long ago that I was banned. I've had a couple of books banned in Australia. One was nearly let off, but the judge called for a magnifying glass. It was a comic strip that I wrote during the 60s called Barry Mackenzie, which I've lived to regret. And the 60s, that is, not the book. Luckily, I don't remember very much about the 60s. But Barry Mackenzie was about an Australian in London. It was a grotesque travesty of what we were really like. But it was popular, you see, with English people because it helped them sneer at us, you see. And yet they secretly envied us, you see, our vocabulary, our capacity for alcohol, and our ability to vomit anywhere we felt like it. So Barry Mackenzie had been banned in New Zealand, so it was also banned in Australia, along with another book of mine, which I wanted to be banned, but lately, of course, I've slowly become more and more conservative. And I look sometimes with disdain on the works of adventurous, imaginative, artistic people who are much, much younger and more gifted than I am. I try to retain a childish view of life. But this is terrific, and I'm thinking that my mother would have enjoyed it. She was a complicated woman. And she liked to do things like point to the bad review in the Melbourne Age and say, with one of those smiles which she always wore when about to deliver a zinger. And she'd say, not everyone likes you, Barry. I guess it was her misfortune that she had that attitude, but I took it quite to heart. And I know not everyone likes me, but I really think most people do. Certainly a view I share. And when Oscar Levant, George Gershwin's great friend and interpreter, said to him, Oscar, if you had your life all over again, would you still fall in love with yourself? I tend to identify. On a final chlorine-scented note, having heard from our great swimmer tonight, I learned swimming, I learned everything. My father did all he desperately could. I had golf lessons from Ozzie Pickworth. I had tennis lessons from John Bromwich. They all gave up in despair. They nearly slashed their wrists. I had painting lessons, boxing lessons, and swimming lessons from a German who'd spent the war interned. Gus Fröhlich was his name. And Gus was a very nice little chap. He'd been in a prison camp throughout the war and been stranded in Australia in 1939. And my father said to me one day, we owe Gus a bit of money for those lessons down at Mornington. He said, take this cheque around to him. He lives several streets away. So I went with this envelope. And I knocked on Gus's door, and it was opened by a very tall, handsome, blonde woman with plaited hair. And she said, oh, just wait in here. Gus will be out to see you. So I sat in the little sitting room, waiting for Gus to turn up to collect his money. And on the mantelpiece was a framed photograph of Gus, a much younger Gus, receiving a silver cup from Adolf Hitler. Occasionally, you see, history touches us in Australia. That was an event I've never forgotten. He was the great arch-villain of my childhood and of Europe's middle age, on a mantelpiece in a Melbourne suburb. shaking hands with my swimming teacher. I might go back to swimming. There are a few things I'd quite like to do. I met a military man last year, and he said, would you ever consider doing something for your old regiment? And I said, on condition that I have an honorary rank in the army. Because I really do want to go into a restaurant and hear the maitre d' saying, would you show Captain Humphries to his table? That's my final ambition. I make it known to you in case there's someone here who has the power to make that happen. Meanwhile, thanks for your support. I don't know what's in this box. I'm frightened of it, actually. But as long as it doesn't fall out of my lapel, I'm sure it's very good. Oh, my God, look at that. So thanks, it's Australia, and as usual, Tasmania is missing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, while we take the photographs out here, the main course will be served, and then I'll come back after that to introduce our next entertainment. Thank you.